Maybe you're wondering why everything feels heavier than it should. You do what you can. You keep moving forward. You try to stay faithful and responsible, yet inside, something feels exhausted. This video is not about empty motivation or being stronger. It's about understanding why you feel at your limit, even though you haven't given up, and why that does not mean weakness. Throughout this video, you'll begin to recognize invisible weights that many people carry without realizing it. Accumulated responsibilities, expectations that were never yours, constant emotional pressure, and a mind that never truly rests. Here, you'll learn to discern what is actually overloading you, how it affects your soul, your faith, and your decisions, and why God never called you to carry everything alone. Do you feel tired even after sleeping? Do you feel guilty for not being able to handle it all? Do you keep trying to stay strong while feeling empty inside? What if the problem isn't a lack of faith or emotional weakness, but the result of carrying too much weight in the wrong places? Stay until the end. This video may help you release what was never yours to carry. You can recognize this kind of tiredness immediately. You sleep, you complete your tasks, you keep functioning. Yet inside, there is a constant weight. It's not a tiredness that physical rest can fix. It feels like you are always carrying something extra, something that never fully turns off. Many people begin to question themselves at this point, wondering if they are becoming weak, unmotivated, or spiritually empty, when in reality they are simply sustaining an inner load that was never released. There is a clear difference between physical fatigue and ongoing emotional exhaustion. The body grows tired from effort and usually responds to rest. Emotional exhaustion is born from accumulation. It forms when worries, internal tension, mental responsibilities, and emotional pressure pile up over time. This state is not caused by a single event, but by the quiet sum of many small weights that were never recognized or processed. When this accumulation takes place, the emotional system remains on alert. Even during moments of pause, something inside continues operating as if there were danger. Thoughts return, decisions are revisited, scenarios are anticipated. The body may rest, but the inner world never truly does. This is why so many people wake up tired even after a full night's sleep. Scripture describes this process with precision when it says, "Anxiety weighs down the heart, but a kind word brings joy." Proverbs 12:25. The text does not call this condition weakness or lack of faith. It speaks of an inner weight that slowly presses on the heart. Anxiety here is not just momentary worry, but the ongoing effect of carrying more than the soul was created to sustain. In everyday life, this kind of tiredness appears in subtle ways. You do what needs to be done, but everything seems to require more energy than before. Small decisions feel draining. Simple interactions leave you exhausted. You struggle to fully relax, even in moments that should feel light. There is a constant sense that something is still pending, even when there is nothing specific left to resolve. Often you notice that your mind is always moving ahead, thinking about the next step, the next responsibility, the next possible problem. The mind never slows down. It stays busy trying to keep everything in order. And when the opportunity to stop finally appears, an unfamiliar restlessness comes with it, as if resting were unsafe or inappropriate. This pattern also creates guilt. Guilt for feeling tired without a visible reason. Guilt for not performing as you once did. Guilt for needing rest when on the surface, everything seems fine. This guilt adds another layer to the exhaustion, increasing the inner weight and creating a cycle that feels difficult to break. Over time, this way of living begins to feel normal. You grow accustomed to being tired, to functioning at the edge of your limits, to carrying weight as part of adulthood, responsibility, or even faith. The problem is that functioning does not mean you are well. Moving forward is not the same as being healthy inside. This quiet shift in expectation causes clear signs of overload to be ignored. The person continues completing tasks, honoring commitments, and maintaining the appearance of stability, but the internal cost keeps growing. There is no sudden collapse, only gradual wear. The soul slowly grows heavier, while everything on the outside appears unchanged. It is this contrast that makes exhaustion so confusing and difficult to name. This kind of exhaustion drains you precisely because it is invisible. Unlike physical effort, which has a clear beginning and end, emotional accumulation has no defined boundaries. It weaves itself into daily life, blends with legitimate responsibilities, and begins to feel normal. The person does not realize they are carrying too much. They only know they are always tired. The mind adapts to this condition. It learns to operate in a state of constant vigilance. Over time, what was once an exception becomes the standard. The body holds up. The routine continues. But the soul begins to show signs of being weighed down, exactly as the biblical text describes. That is why resting the body does not always solve the problem when the weight is invisible. You may sleep more, slow down for a few days, or change external habits, and still feel something heavy inside. This happens because the wear is not only in what you do, but in what you keep active internally, without space for release or clarity. Perhaps this is exactly where you are right now, functioning well in the eyes of others, maintaining responsibilities, keeping your faith, yet feeling drained inside. This first step is not about changing anything yet. It is about honestly recognizing that the problem is not a lack of strength. It is an excess of accumulated weight. And as long as that excess goes unnamed, exhaustion will continue to be misunderstood. Many of the things that exhaust you today did not begin as a problem. They began as legitimate responsibilities. At one point, they were proportional, manageable, and even healthy. You were able to handle them without feeling like you were losing yourself inside. The wear did not come because you failed, but because those responsibilities grew over time and were almost never consciously reviewed. Scripture makes an important distinction when it says, each one should carry their own load, Galatians 6:5. The load mentioned here is not something crushing. It represents a burden adjusted to the capacity of the one carrying it. A healthy load requires effort, but it does not drain inner life. It does not keep the mind in a constant state of tension or turn existence into emotional survival. The problem begins when legitimate responsibilities stop being proportional. Functions accumulate, roles expand, demands increase, almost always gradually. You take on more because it seems necessary, because someone has to do it, because it's temporary, because you can handle it. Without realizing it, what was once a part of your life begins to take up too much space inside you. Over time, many responsibilities stop being tasks and become fixed structures. They are no longer questioned, they simply continue. A quiet thought appears. This is how it's always been. You keep going not because it still makes sense, but because reviewing it feels wrong, risky, or selfish. This pattern creates inner weight because the heart senses misalignment but finds no room to adjust. Many of these structures remain not because they are still necessary, but because they have become invisible. You no longer remember when you began carrying them. You only know they are there. The weight grows without announcement, without a clear decision, without a conscious moment of choice. This makes excess difficult to identify because it blends into routine and starts to feel like a natural part of life. This kind of accumulation creates automatic inner functioning. Even when nothing new is being asked, the mind continues holding everything that has already been assumed. There is a constant sense that something must be kept standing. The person never fully relaxes because they feel that if they stop holding things together, something will fall apart. This silent vigilance consumes emotional energy without offering rest. In everyday life, this shows up as a constant sense of obligation. Even when one task ends, the mind does not rest. Another demand is already waiting, another role to sustain, another unspoken expectation. You feel the need to always be available, always attentive, always ready to fix things. Rest is never complete because responsibility never truly ends. It only changes form. In many cases, responsibility stops being something you do and begins to define who you are. You start to see yourself as the one who fixes things, the one who carries it, the one who can't stop. A quiet belief forms: if you let go, everything will fall apart. If I don't do it, no one will. This turns commitment into identity and creates a deep structural weight. This kind of overload is especially exhausting because it is not recognized as excess. It is seen as maturity, commitment, or strength. The person keeps functioning, keeps being responsible, keeps being faithful, yet inside they begin to feel drained. Not because they work too much, but because they carry more than they were meant to carry alone. Discerning this limit is essential. Not everything you carry today is truly your load. Some responsibilities grew beyond what was originally entrusted to you. Others were assumed out of habit, fear of conflict, or an exaggerated sense of duty. Recognizing this does not require immediate change. It requires clarity. Before letting anything go, you must first see where the weight stopped being healthy. When this discernment begins, something inside starts to realign. You begin to realize that not every weight you carry was actually placed on you by God. And this realization opens space to identify even subtler burdens, ones that also contribute to this deep exhaustion. A significant part of the exhaustion you feel may not come from what you do, but from what you feel you must emotionally carry for others. These are expectations that were never clearly placed on you, yet over time, they began to live inside you. You start acting not only out of responsibility, but to preserve relationships, maintain balance, or avoid disappointing people. This kind of weight is quiet, but deeply draining. It's important to distinguish between expectations and responsibilities. Responsibilities are usually objective: tasks, commitments, clearly defined roles. Emotional expectations are subjective. They grow from looks, silences, old patterns and environments where you learned that you had to meet certain standards in order to be accepted. The problem is that when these expectations go unrecognized, they begin to operate internally as invisible obligations, demanding constant attention. Over time, you begin to maintain images: the image of being strong, of enduring, of not disappointing anyone, of always handling things well. This constant maintenance requires emotional vigilance. You think before you speak, measure your decisions, and hold back feelings to avoid discomfort. Without realizing it, your mind starts working non-stop to preserve positions that may never have needed to be sustained this way. Many of these expectations didn't come from direct requests, but from repeated experiences throughout life. Moments when pleasing others prevented conflict, times when taking a stand led to rejection, environments where meeting expectations seemed like the only way to maintain connection. Gradually, the heart learns to anticipate, trying to protect relationships even before anything is demanded. This learning creates an internal pattern that is difficult to notice because it disguises itself as care. You believe you are being attentive, empathetic, and responsible, when in reality you are carrying emotional weight that was never asked of you. The mind begins to monitor reactions, adjust behavior, and constantly review interactions, creating an inner state of alert that drains energy without providing rest. Scripture describes this process clearly when it says, "The fear of man lays a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is safe." Proverbs 29:25. This fear is not limited to explicit fear of people. It includes the constant concern of disappointing others, being misunderstood, losing value, or losing acceptance. This dynamic becomes a trap because it shifts the center of inner security. Instead of resting in God, the soul begins to orient itself around the reactions of others. In everyday life, this shows up as ongoing tension. You replay conversations after they happen. Anticipation builds before simple interactions. There is always a sense that something must be adjusted to maintain harmony. Even in silence, the mind keeps working, not because there is a real problem, but because there is fear of creating an emotional problem with someone. When pleasing others turns into a strategy for emotional survival, inner freedom begins to shrink. Your choices become guided more by how they will affect others than by what is healthy for you. This doesn't mean a lack of integrity or honesty. It simply means that at some point in your story, pleasing others felt safer than standing your ground. This pattern also directly affects practical faith. Trusting God becomes more difficult when much of your emotional energy is spent sustaining human expectations. You continue believing, you continue obeying, yet internally you live under pressure as if you are constantly being evaluated. Faith stops being a place of rest and becomes effort because the heart cannot find a safe place to settle. Over time, this weight begins to create inner confusion. You wonder why you feel tired when, on the surface, you are doing nothing wrong. You meet responsibilities, maintain relationships, and keep moving forward, yet something inside you remains tense. This exhaustion does not come from a lack of faith, but from the constant attempt to carry expectations that were never yours to bear. Recognizing this kind of weight does not mean breaking relationships or becoming indifferent to people. It means discerning what truly belongs to you and what was internalized without awareness. Some expectations were never spoken. Others belong more to other people's insecurities than to your calling. When you begin to identify these emotional burdens, something inside starts to realign. The mind gains space, the heart slows down, and faith begins to settle into a safer place. When the mind remains overloaded for a long time, the experience of faith begins to change in almost imperceptible ways. Not because God is distant, and not because the person has stopped believing, but because the inner world never truly comes to rest. There is a constant flow of thoughts, worries, and attempts to anticipate problems. Faith is still present, but it begins to operate within an environment of ongoing tension. An overloaded mind learns to live in a state of alert. Even when there is no immediate problem, something inside behaves as if it must be prepared at all times. Thoughts repeat themselves, scenarios are rehearsed, decisions are revisited again and again. This is not a lack of trust. It is the result of accumulated mental responsibility. The mind tries to compensate for emotional weight by keeping everything under control. Over time, this pattern creates the belief that thinking more means caring better for life. The person assumes that by anticipating everything, they can avoid mistakes, pain, or loss. The problem is that this constant vigilance consumes inner energy. The mind never fully rests. Even in moments of silence, it keeps working, carrying a weight it was never meant to hold alone. Many people do not even notice when this way of functioning becomes automatic. The mind wakes up already accelerated, begins the day reviewing pending matters, predicting problems, and organizing everything internally before any action takes place. There is no clear moment of mental rest because the inner world has grown accustomed to operating under constant pressure. This continuous effort creates spiritual fatigue, not because of too much external activity, but because of too much internal control. This pattern also affects how a person relates to God. Prayer begins from tension rather than rest. Instead of surrender, there is mental alignment. Instead of trust, there is effort to keep everything in order. Faith remains genuine, but it unfolds within an emotional environment that does not foster rest, only endurance. Scripture presents a powerful contrast when it says, "In peace I lie down and sleep, for you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety." Psalm 4:8. This verse does not describe a life without challenges, but a heart that knows where its source of security lies. The peace described here does not come from the absence of problems, but from trusting that ultimate protection does not depend on constant human control. When the mind tries to control everything in order to avoid failure, faith begins to lose ground. The person prays but does not rest, believes but remains tense, trusts God yet feels unable to fully relax. Not because they do not want to trust, but because they learn to survive by keeping everything under internal surveillance. This state weakens the experience of faith by shifting the heart from rest into continuous effort. There is an important difference between responsibility and constant vigilance. Responsibility knows when to act and when to stop. It recognizes limits. Constant vigilance, on the other hand, never rests because it believes that if it relaxes, something will go wrong. This pattern steals the space where faith is meant to grow, turning spiritual life into quiet resistance. In everyday life, this shows up in simple but persistent ways. Difficulty shutting the mind off at night, guilt when trying to rest, discomfort when nothing urgent is happening. The person feels they should be doing something, thinking about something, fixing something. Rest stops feeling natural and begins to feel unproductive or even unsafe. Resting in this context is not giving up on life or ignoring responsibilities. It is a direct fruit of trust. When the mind begins to recognize that it does not have to sustain everything on its own, something inside starts to reorganize. Faith stops being only strength to keep going and becomes a place of real support. Peace does not come because everything has been resolved, but because the heart no longer tries to occupy a place that was never meant to be its own. This adjustment does not happen instantly. It begins with awareness. When you understand how mental overload has been weakening your experience with God without you realizing it, space opens for a different kind of strength. A strength that does not come from control, but from trust. And this clarity prepares the ground to face an even deeper pattern present in many exhausted people: the belief that always being strong is a spiritual requirement. Many people reach a deep level of exhaustion because they learned over time that mature faith is the same as constant strength. There is a quiet expectation that those who trust God should not show limits, should not slow down, should not admit weakness. The person keeps moving forward, keeps serving, keeps believing, always pushing their tiredness down as if it had no permission to exist. This pattern is often reinforced by a false spiritualization of endurance. Real biblical truths begin to be used as justification to ignore clear signs of inner wear. Phrases like, "God gives me strength," "I can endure because I trust," or "I can't stop now," begin to sustain a pace the heart can no longer keep up with. Faith, which should be a place of support, becomes fuel to constantly push beyond limits. The problem is not believing that God strengthens. The problem arises when that truth is used to deny one's own humanity. When tiredness is consistently silenced in the name of strength, it does not disappear. It deepens. The person continues functioning, but disconnected from their own limits, believing that acknowledging weakness would be a sign of spiritual failure or immaturity. Often this pattern settles in so subtly that the person no longer remembers when they began demanding too much of themselves. They simply learn not to stop. They learn to ignore internal signals. They learn to pressure themselves before anyone else does. Over time, this self-demand becomes automatic. Even when no one is asking for more, they keep pushing themselves, as if slowing down were dangerous or spiritually inappropriate. This way of living creates a constant tension between what a person feels and what they believe they should feel. Inside, there is exhaustion. On the outside, there is performance. This disconnection causes deep wear because the soul begins to live divided. The person does not allow themselves to be cared for where they truly are, because they believe they must maintain a posture of strength in order to remain in the right place before God. Scripture directly confronts this logic when it says, "When I am weak, then I am strong." 2 Corinthians 12:10. This statement does not glorify suffering or exalt inability. It reveals a deep spiritual principle. The strength that sustains the Christian life does not come from self-sufficiency, but from dependence. Paul does not hide his limitation. He acknowledges it as the place where God's grace becomes most evident. There is a high spiritual cost to never allowing yourself to stop. When someone lives trying to sustain an image of strength, they lose space to be cared for. They pray, but do not rest. They serve, but do not receive. They trust, but do not fully surrender. Faith begins to operate in endurance mode, not in relationship. This produces a rigid, exhausted, and often lonely spirituality, even when surrounded by people. There is also an even subtler risk in this pattern: self-sufficiency disguised as maturity. The person does not say they do not need God, but lives as though they depend primarily on their own inner firmness. Prayer becomes a constant request for energy to keep going, rather than a space of real surrender. Faith turns into an obligation to remain strong, instead of a place where rest is allowed. When weakness is not acknowledged, exhaustion gains an additional layer of weight: guilt. Guilt for not performing as before, guilt for needing rest, guilt for feeling limits where strength is expected. The person begins to judge themselves for what they feel, creating a deep internal conflict. Beyond being tired, they begin to feel wrong for being tired. The gospel presents a path opposite to this logic. Weakness, when acknowledged with honesty, does not push God away. It creates space for his action. God does not sustain spiritually invincible characters. He sustains real people, human, limited, and learning to trust more than to constantly prove themselves. The strength that comes from him does not require denying limits, but surrender. As this false spiritualization of strength begins to be dismantled, something inside starts to realign. The person does not become negligent or abandon responsibility. They simply stop demanding from themselves what God never demanded. Faith stops being heavy armor and becomes living support. This inner adjustment prepares the heart to understand something essential that still needs to be discerned. Letting go of weight is not giving up on life. It is aligning the way we walk with God. Letting go of weight often feels frightening because, for many people, it sounds like giving up. There is a fear that if the load is lightened, something important will stop working. Someone will be disappointed, or life will fall out of control. That is why, even when exhausted, many people continue carrying more than they can bear, believing that releasing certain burdens would be a sign of irresponsibility, weakness, or lack of commitment to what truly matters. Jesus' invitation was never to abandon life, but to realign the way it is carried. When he says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. He is not speaking to those who quit, but to those who kept walking even while tired. The rest offered here is not an escape from reality, but an inner repositioning. This rest does not come from the absence of responsibility, but from the exchange of the yoke. A misaligned yoke wounds, presses, and exhausts. It makes the journey heavier than it needs to be. A well-fitted yoke does not eliminate effort, but it distributes weight in a healthy way. Jesus does not remove you from the path. He adjusts how you walk on it. There is a profound difference between carrying with God and carrying in God's place. Carrying with God involves discernment, boundaries, and real dependence. Carrying in God's place happens when you take on control, outcomes, and emotional responsibilities that were never entrusted to you. Often, this comes from fear. Fear of failing, fear of losing something, fear of not being enough if you stop holding everything together on your own. Many times, the greatest obstacle to letting go is not responsibility itself, but the feeling that you must guarantee that everything turns out well. There is internal pressure to secure results, protect people, prevent future mistakes, and keep everything functioning in balance. This kind of load was not assumed in a clear moment. It formed gradually as you tried to be prudent, faithful, and committed. The problem is that when this guarantee depends entirely on you, the weight stops being healthy and begins to occupy a place the human heart was never meant to hold. This kind of weight also creates a quiet confusion between care and control. You believe you are being responsible, when in reality you are trying to prevent anything from going wrong at all costs. The mind stays active, anticipating scenarios, holding possibilities, carrying consequences that do not yet exist. This continuous effort does not produce greater faithfulness. It produces wear. And the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to see that part of this weight was never yours to carry in the first place. Over time, these burdens, assumed out of fear, habit, or prolonged silence, stop being recognized as extra. They begin to feel normal. You no longer question whether you should be carrying them. You simply feel the constant fatigue. The body keeps functioning, the mind keeps pushing, but the soul begins to show clear signs of wear, asking for adjustment, not surrender. Letting go in this context does not mean abandoning what matters. It means returning what was never yours to carry. It means recognizing that some burdens belong to God, others belong to the choices of other people, and some no longer make sense in the season of life you are in. This movement requires faith because it involves releasing control, not responsibility. Before any external change, this process begins internally. Letting go does not start with drastic decisions, but with a repositioning of the heart. It is changing the point from which you carry. When the mind begins to understand that it does not have to sustain everything on its own, something inside starts to adjust. The same tasks may remain, but the emotional weight attached to them begins to lessen. This alignment does not happen all at once. It is gradual. Jesus does not impose a rushed pace of change. He invites you into a better aligned walk. His yoke does not promise a life without demands, but it does promise presence, direction, and rest in the midst of them. It is within this quiet adjustment that the soul slowly begins to breathe again. This is not an ending. It is a point of inner reorganization. As you begin to realign the yoke, new perceptions emerge, new choices become possible, and life starts to be lived from a different place. The path continues, responsibilities remain, but something essential changes. You are no longer walking misaligned or alone. From here, the heart is ready to receive a closing that does not pressure, does not rush, and does not demand. It simply invites clarity, surrender, and conscious rest. Perhaps by the time you've reached this point, you haven't received immediate answers or practical solutions for everything you carry, and that is intentional. This video was never about fixing life all at once or organizing every detail of what exhausts you. It was about changing the place from which you look at your tiredness. It was about realizing that what you experienced as weakness, discouragement, or spiritual failure was actually the natural result of weight being unevenly distributed over time. Along this journey, something became clearer. You are not tired because you stopped trusting God. You are tired because you trusted yourself too much to sustain things that were never meant to rest on you alone. Responsibilities grew, expectations seeped in, the mind learned to monitor everything. Faith was used as constant strength, and little by little, the soul began to show signs of exhaustion. None of this happened all at once. There was no single mistake, no wrong decision, no specific failure. There was accumulation, there was adaptation, there was silence. You learned how to endure. You learned not to stop. You learned how to function even while tired, and in the process the weight became normal, almost invisible, until exhaustion became constant. Perhaps now you can recognize something important. Continuing to function is not the same as being well. Maintaining faith is not the same as resting in God. Honoring responsibilities does not mean carrying everything alone. There is a deep difference between faithfulness and overload, between commitment and control, between trust and constant vigilance. Jesus never called the overly strong. He called the weary, the burdened, those who kept walking even without strength but could no longer carry the weight the way they had been carrying it. His invitation was not to abandon life, but to realign the yoke, to change the way of walking, to learn how to carry with him instead of carrying in his place. Perhaps the greatest adjustment this video invites is not external, but internal. It is not about doing less immediately or changing everything right now. It is about stopping the demand placed on the wrong point, about no longer calling weakness what is actually the soul's honest request for a redistribution of weight, about no longer spiritualizing exhaustion as virtue when so often it is simply a sign of excess. You do not need to decide everything now. You do not need to resolve every responsibility today. You do not need to identify every burden at once. The first rest comes before change. It begins when you recognize that you were never called to sustain everything alone. When you allow God to once again occupy the place that, without realizing it, you tried to fill with control, effort, and resistance. Perhaps from here you can simply remain in silence for a few moments, not to search for solutions or plan adjustments, but to notice what has already begun to shift inside. The weight may not be gone. The responsibilities may still be there, but something may feel different now. A little less tense, a little clearer, a little more supported. True rest does not come when everything is resolved. It comes when the heart understands that it does not need to hold everything together in order to be safe. It comes when faith stops being constant effort and becomes a place of support again. It comes as you slowly learn to release what was never yours to carry and to trust that God is still caring for what you cannot see. If this video helped you name what exhausts you, then something essential has already taken place. Do not rush the process. Do not demand immediate adjustments from yourself. Simply allow this clarity to stay with you, because sometimes the first sign of healing is not renewed strength. It is the permission to rest without guilt.